This panel has a very interesting title, the Chamaleonic change, which is a word that I particularly enjoyed, and I think is actually quite apt for the subject. When it comes to the threats that we all encounter from terrorism, the most important consistency is change. And we've seen that over the years as terrorism has evolved from a problem that was largely and predominantly a question of state sponsorship to one that moved to independent groups that were financed through networks of donors, to self-sustaining entities that aspire to run populations. Terrorism is not all the same thing. There's lots of different kinds of terrorist groups that differ tremendously in their motivations, in their environment, in their goals, and thus the threats that they pose. Terrorist threats also differs tremendously in geographies. There was a time at which a certain geography in the world was the center of our perception of the terrorist threats in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Then it moved to Iraq and Syria. Now a lot of the attention is in Africa, and it will continue to move again. And with each one of these evolutions, there is an evolution in the tactics and approaches that the West and the other parts of the world that are threatened by terrorism take in response. Sometimes it's a military response, sometimes it's a law enforcement response, sometimes it's an ideological battle, sometimes it's a question of internet security, sometimes it's a question of winning the quote-unquote hearts and minds, and sometimes it's a very local issue. And in order to address these, our responses have to change in each place. And as we look to the future, we can anticipate threats changing even more. As the United States exits Afghanistan, the questions are very much open about what the future of the terrorist threat is there. As France exits some of its work in the Sahel, as local dynamics in Mali lead to Russia coming in and much of Europe leaving MINUSMA, these will affect the terrorist threats as well. We have with us an absolutely wonderful panel. Let me just introduce each one in turn, and then we're going to have a conversation that's going to first talk about the threats and challenges, and then talk about the solutions and approaches. Person immediately to my left is Ilka Salmi. He is the counterterrorism coordinator for the European Union since last year. He was, before that, the permanent secretary of the Ministry of the Interior in Finland from 2018 to 2020. And he was the director of the Finnish Security Intelligence Service from 2007 to 2011. Before joining the Ministry of the Interior, he served as director of the EU Intelligence and Situation Center. There are very few people that I can think of that have the perspective on counterterrorism that's appropriate to this conference as Mr. Salmi. Next is Olivier Roy, who, for those of us who have read about counterterrorism for years, needs no introduction, but I'll give it anyway. He's a senior researcher at French National Center for Scientific Research. He's a professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and a visiting professor at the University of California at Berkeley. He's headed missions in the OSCE, he's headed offices in the UN, and he's been a consultant for many decades to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs policy planning staff. Next on the line is Mona Yacoubian. Her work, which I follow all the time in Washington, D.C., at the U.S. Institute of Peace, centers on conflict analysis and prevention in the Middle East. Her particular areas of focus are in the Levant and Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. She was the executive director of the congressionally mandated Syria study group, and her past experience in government includes as an deputy assistant administrator for the Middle East at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And finally, but absolutely not least, is Hisham Helier, my old friend and colleague previously from the Atlantic Council. He has since moved on to much more important things. He is a senior fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. He's a British scholar and analyst of the modern Middle East and North Africa, faith and politics in Europe, majority-minority relations, Muslim world, West relations, and he is also a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a fellow of Cambridge University's Center for Islamic Studies. With that, let me start, Mr. Salmi. Can you talk about, right now, how Europe sees the threats, the most important threats of terrorism? Is it from individuals that are self-radicalizing online? Is it from organized threats? Is it from a particular geography? Where does the EU, and are there differences between the perceptions of some of the member states?
Indeed. Thank you so much, and indeed, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really my pleasure to be here and address some of the questions today, and indeed, I do believe that, of course, my perspective is from the European and the EU's point of view, but then again, I do believe that many of these issues are actually quite global, so in that sense, makes sense to look into that. When I say that I look issues from the EU's point of view, it does not mean that the terrorism threat level is the same in every single EU member state. That goes without saying. But nevertheless, and having said that, I do believe that there are still lots of similarities that are actually the same, irrespective of which part of Europe, which EU member state you think of, or Europe in more general. So the threat remains elevated and it remains complex as ever. And I think that William already addressed some of the questions which actually are, let's say, the more traditional ones. The Islamist terrorism is still there, the main issue. The threat from Daesh, Al-Qaeda still exists, and actually the relatively recent developments, be it in northeast Syria, Iraq, or in Afghanistan, actually underlines this issue, and happy to say a few words about that in a second. However, at the same time, I think the most pertinent threat towards Europe is actually let's call them lone actors, or what do we want, actually those who are inspired by terrorist narratives and actually get radicalized online and get their innovation from the social media, internet platforms, what have you. So this is actually something where we have to look very closely, and I think this is actually when we discuss what are the measures that we could address, certainly looking into the new and emerging technologies is hugely important. For me personally, one of the key regions geographically is northeast Syria still, even if the caliphate has been defeated as a geographical entity in a way, it's still an issue, and especially camps like Al-Hol, where we have still lots of women and children, as well as, of course, the foreign terrorist fighters who are detained in the region, is an issue that I would say a strategic issue for us. Even if it might not be always very diplomatic to say, I believe that camps like Al-Hol are a bit of a ticking time bomb. They are incubators for the next generation of Daesh, and in order to address that, I think that we should do whatever it takes to support not only Iraq and Syria, but also other countries to bring back their citizens from the region. And actually, personally, I have been visiting the region a couple of times during the course of this year, and also engaged with the Iraqi government and authorities in order to understand how we could assist the situation in the camps, and especially the repatriation and the reintegration process of Iraqi citizens from the region. A second point which I'm concerned is the radicalization in prisons, again, and not a new issue. However, there's one element which is relatively new and will be significant in the coming years, is the question of those foreign terrorist fighters who were imprisoned in Europe, in the EU member states, and who are going to be released in the coming months and years. We will have a significant number of individuals who will walk free soon, and then of course we would hope that they have been de-radicalized during the prison sentences, but I think we all share that that might not be the case as far as everyone is concerned. Third point that I wish to raise is the violent right-wing extremism. And as I said, as far as the EU member states are concerned, there are member states that consider today the violent right-wing extremism to be actually the threat that they have in their respective countries. The German Federal Minister of Interior did raise this issue when she was appointed last year as one of the, earlier this year, as one of the first things and first issues that they need to tackle. As far as the violent right-wing extremism is concerned, there are elements where especially the online issues are hugely important. The connections, not only within Europe but more globally, are extremely important, and the role of internet is indeed a significant one. This brings me to another question, which is not terrorism as such, but a kind of a development that we have to follow closely, what I call the anti-system movement or the anti-government movement. And as I said, it's not terrorism, but it could have a polarizing effect on our societies. And that's a very tricky issue, as it's very difficult to, let's say, define what are we talking about. It's different movements, different people being involved, and the sentiments and the mistrust of our governments might be building and mounting up, and we have to address this issue. And then just as a very final point on the new and emerging technologies, we have to make sure that our law enforcement and security authorities have access to the newest technologies on one hand, and we have to make sure that let's say the bad guys do not have that same access. And a specific question on a European level is also let's say the balance, the right balance between privacy and security. How do we strike a balance where at the same time there would be privacy and the fundamental rights respected in one hand, but at the same time that we guarantee the access, the lawful access to data and information for our law enforcement agencies to tackle the terrorism threat. So these are basically let's say the four elements that I see as the main issues today.
Thank you very much. Just picking up on some of that, Mr. Hua, you've talked about the changing balance between the global jihad and the local jihad. I'm particularly interested in that thinking, and we reflect to the tour d'horizon that we just got from the commissioner. And please let me. I'm especially interested in what you think about Afghanistan, where I know that you've worked for a while. So please tell us what you see as the threats.
Yeah, it started in Afghanistan, the creation of a network of global jihadists under the leadership of bin Laden. And then in the early 90s, they left the area and they went mostly to their countries of origin, where they created some radical networks and so. So until 1995, there is, I would say, almost a physical connection between what was going on in Afghanistan and global terrorism. But from 1995, we have a new generation. We have a generation of homegrown radicals, people who were born, educated in the West, for instance, and who radicalized in the West, not in Afghanistan, and then decided to go to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and so, and to join any available jihad. So they went to Bosnia, they tried to go to Chechnya, they went again to Afghanistan, to Yemen, and later to Syria and Iraq. So for almost 20 years, 1995 and 2015, 16, we have the same profile. Second generation Muslims, migrant Muslims, and converts. A lot of converts. We tend to ignore, the factor of converts, but it's sometimes like something like 25-30% of the radicals involved in jihad and terrorism. These people joined. At the beginning, they were not linked to an organization, but at the end of the 90s, they joined Al-Qaeda. And then they joined Daesh and went to Syria to fight. They had good training, they had networks of logistics, etc. And they did, of course, 9/11, the Bataclan in France, Madrid, London, etc., etc. Since 2016, we have a change. Now, we have no more well-organized networks. That's finished. We have more and more individuals, sometimes lone wolves, who use makeshift weapons, knives, for instance, who are not very efficient. They kill and they are killed, or they kill themselves. And their profile is far more diverse. So what I see is a decline of a global jihadism. And it's less a threat than it used to be. My guess, but it's just a guess, is that it's largely linked to a generational phenomena, but we might go back to that. But what is on the rise now is local jihad. Niger, all the Sahel, Somalia, Sinai, etc. This local jihad, they used to link themselves with an organization of global jihad, either Al-Qaeda or Daesh. So they make allegiance. But in fact, they fight locally, and for local reasons. And the president of Niger explained this morning. It's largely linked, to what I call the political anthropology of the society. And interestingly enough, we have no terrorist spillover of this local jihad, global terrorism. Let's take an example. France was in the first line in Mali to fight against the local jihad since 2013. We had a lot of terrorist attacks after 2013. None of the terrorists involved in this attack claimed to act because of Mali. They all claim that they wanted to avenge the people in Syria and Iraq. They all claim to belong to a global jihad, and none of them, even the guy who came from Sahel, did mention the local jihad in Sahel. So this disconnect between local jihad and global jihad is something which is very important. I am not sure that I have all the cues on that, but we have to look on that. And if we go back to the source, to Afghanistan, well, in Afghanistan, the Taliban are on our side against terrorism. They are not on our side about women's rights. That's clear, But about terrorism, they are fighting Daesh. They gave all the insurances that they will not host radical groups, and they cooperate. Because, in fact, there is a cooperation with the Taliban. Of course, we have no choice. So Afghanistan is no more, the place of radicalization. I didn't hear about young radicals coming from Europe going to Afghanistan now. It's not fashionable, Afghanistan, and it's probably not very funny. That's another story. So I think that Afghanistan is no more an issue. Pakistan is more a problem than Afghanistan, far more a problem. Because still there is the radical movement in Pakistan have I will not say global agenda, but there's a global perception of what Islam is. They are connected with diaspora, etc., etc. So I think now that the narrative of the heroic global jihad is running out of steam. It doesn't mean that there will be no terrorist actions related to jihad and so, of course, but on a smaller scale. But that it means also that we have other threats now than we used to have during the last 20 years.
Thank you very much. Mona, let me turn to you next. It's still the case that the greatest concentration of terrorist fighters are in Syria right now, by most estimates, even as our attention goes elsewhere. And as we've already heard, the potential for a lot more terrorists to come out of camps and jails there is potentially a ticking time bomb, as we heard. Can you tell us how the Levant in general sees the terrorist threat and how you see it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Will. And it's a real pleasure to be here and, frankly, to be on this esteemed panel. So I want to push back a little bit on the ticking time bomb metaphor. But before I do that, I will certainly associate myself with the analysis that, indeed, there are still a concentration of ISIS fighters, although they are not holding territory. They're largely organized as sleeper cells. But there is certainly a concern, I think, about ISIS resurgence. In other words, we can't take our eye off the ball. That being said, that word chameleonic, I think, applies quite well to what I want to talk about, which is that I think we are looking at a very complex evolution of the challenge. And I think the place we see it best is in the El Hol displacement camp. Why I say that, I think El Hol is unprecedented. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find another place in the world that has this mix of security and protection challenges. For those who don't know, El Hol is a camp of about 55,000 residents, mostly women and children. 50% of them are under the age of 12. They primarily are comprised of people who streamed out of ISIS's last territorial stronghold in Syria and Bahus. And so you have this mix of real security challenges, for sure. The camp is increasingly porous, increasingly dangerous. There were raids undertaken within the camp that revealed maybe 300 ISIS operatives in the camp. They've recovered weapons. So this is not your typical displacement camp. But that being said, again, the majority of the camp's residents are children. And they don't have access to education. They don't have access even to adequate humanitarian assistance. And so the real challenge, I think, here is trying to understand the composition of this camp, and frankly, more importantly, how to empty the camp. Because the camp as it is not tenable. It's in a very volatile part of the world. We are, as we sit here, waiting, I think with great concern, to see if Turkey will actually make good on its repeated threats to take another incursion into northeast Syria, which would, I think, very much disrupt the operations around both the securing of the ISIS detention sites, which are the 10,000 plus fighters who are being held, as well as the camp of El Hol and smaller camps. All of this is being undertaken by a non-state actor, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are a Kurdish force, in partnership with the US and others on the ground. And so you have, I think, this sort of incredibly complex and frankly untenable mix of security and protection and humanitarian challenges that really are going to require creative thinking and solutions, which I'm happy to talk about in a bit, Will, in terms of how to go forward. Why don't I stop there?
And we will leave it there because we'll come back to that specific question. But first, let me go to Hisham. You've written very, very widely on a whole variety of facets of the terrorist threat. I'm really interested in your perspectives on how the ideological elements of terrorism have changed and are changing. We've heard a little bit about it from some of the other comments, but if you can please say how you see it changing in the future, that would be really helpful.
Well, thank you, Will. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to be at Med 2022 and on such an illustrious panel and with people in the room that I recognize and I'm very pleased to catch up with. The occasion of this conference is very pertinent because I do a lot of work on the European side of the Mediterranean and also on the southern side in North Africa and the Middle East more generally. And ideologically speaking, yes, there have been developments in terms of how these groups view their ideational bases. But something else that is quite interesting to me is how we, on the other side, from the counterterrorism space, we also view that ideological development as well. And what I've seen over the past, I'd say 5-10 years, there are two things happening at the same time. One, the threat of radical Islamist groups and ideologies has decreased in comparison to what it was before. The nuance in the discussion has somewhat increased, at least in certain places, and others is still in a very bad place. And between the north of the Mediterranean and the south, there's often a difference of opinion as to what constitutes an ideological threat and what doesn't. And on a policy level, this is something that's actually very difficult to overcome when we try to engage in joint policy initiatives across countries. And this, by the way, happens within Europe as well, but very often between North and South. It becomes very difficult for us to do joint programming to identify joint threats because we simply don't always agree on what constitutes an ideological extremist group. You mentioned the Kurds in Syria. The Turks have a particular view on certain groups. DC has a very different view, and so on, and so on, and so on. Different types of Islamist groups, different opinions on whether or not they constitute groups that should or should not be engaged with, and so on. I agree completely, by the way, on the comment about the foreign fighters issue. I think it's something that we're going to have to grapple with very soon, and I'm not sure that we're really prepared for it. And also on the far right issue, and I'm very glad to hear the coordinator speak about that, because at least in my own country, in the UK, the evidence base is extremely clear. The threat that we need to be most concerned about, not only, but most concerned about, is far-right extremism. And for purely ideological reasons, not evidence-based reasons, but ideological reasons, we shy away from that. We don't engage with identifying it. And there's one final aspect to this, and I don't want to belabor this point. The mainstreaming of far-right ideology across the continent, and frankly further beyond, constitutes a major disruption in terms of how we then analyze and identify extremist threats. When we talk about these jihadist groups and so on, nobody's worried about them being elected in open and free elections. I'm very concerned about that on the European continent. I'm very concerned about that, frankly, with regards to the United States, where far-right movements are not on the far, aspect of the political spectrum. They're not on the margins. They're in the center. And even when the groups themselves are not voted for, their discourse, their rhetoric, their concerns and approaches, they're very much part of the mainstream. And that's going to have increasing repercussions on how we identify threats going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we've got a very good overview of the disparate kinds of threats, in both geographically, ideologically, types of terrorist organizations. Now let's turn for the second half of our discussion about what we do about these threats. The reality is that a lot of our approach to this has been driven by an assessment over time, is that while there are lots of different terrorist organizations that pose lots of different challenges locally, that there's a certain kind of terrorist organization that prioritizes external attacks. The response to that has been to prevent them, by using mainly military means in ungoverned spaces, from having the kind of sanctuary, physical sanctuary, from which they can act with impunity, which leads them to those external attacks. And the changes that we've just discussed didn't, happen like the weather. They happened because military action was taken to take down the caliphate. We're seeing the release of some of those military actions. We've certainly seen it in Afghanistan with the U.S. withdrawal. And then we've seen a recent action by the United States to take out Zawahiri in Kabul, thus showing that despite the distinctions between the Taliban and the Islamic State, that the connections between the Taliban and its Haqqani network and the key elements of al-Qaeda still remain quite significant and problematic. And we've seen the Europeans significantly pare back on their actions across the Mediterranean in this. So the question for you then is, given that environment and given the threat, where does Europe go next with this? Europe is obviously focused on Ukraine. Some of the military capabilities are being moved specifically to that direction, German helicopters and others. But but where does Europe go next? Is this going to no longer be an area of focus? Are they going to be focused more on the sanctions campaigns, on the ideological fight? And then the very last question I have to ask, since you brought it up and it's come on, what is finally the prospect for taking in some of the foreign fighters? These are European nationals who fought in Syria, in Iraq largely, and are still there. And I will just say that one of the more, I won't say who and I won't say from which country, but one of the more entertaining conversations that I've had in recent decades was after, from an American perspective, after having Europeans demarche and talk to me about the need to close Guantanamo again and again, which I completely agree. There was a degree of irony when one European government official said, "I have the solution for the foreign fighters. Why don't you take them to Guantanamo?" And it wasn't a joke. So let me throw that over to you.
Good, thank you. Allow me to focus on actually three things on the kind of a response. So the first one, if I go back to Northeast Syria and to Al-Hol, and by the way, I agree everything that what was already said, what the EU is doing now, and as I said, this is very high on also on my personal agenda, is really to see how can we decongest, the camp. 55,000 individuals, indeed, more than half of them underaged, 94% women and children, and then we have the 10,000 plus foreign terrorist fighters who are actually in prisons in the region. With the camp, with the Al-Hol specifically, I have very much welcomed the Iraqi government's position to take back their citizens. I think we are talking about 3,700 as we speak, have already left Al-Hol and are either in these Jeddah camps on the Iraqi side or already reintegrated into their societies. And I believe that this is something that EU should look into now in detail. How could we assist that process and what are the needs, what are the requests that the Iraqi government and authorities might have for us? Actually, I have commissioned a study some weeks ago financed by the European Commission. It's a sort of a gap study that we really want to understand the whole process from bringing back these individuals from Al-Hol to Jeddah and then to reintegrate. I'm talking about Iraqi citizens to be brought back to Iraq. Half of the population in Al-Hol are Iraqis, one or even a bit more, 1/3 are Syrians. So if we manage to convince and assist Iraqis to take back most of that, I think that it would have an immediate impact on not only on the humanitarian situation, as I mentioned, but certainly on the very dire security situation in this camp. And this is something where I'm working hand in hand with my counterparts from the United States, UK, and many others. And of course, goes without saying, also with the member states to see how we could process in that. The question with Syrians is, of course, more tricky as the situation is what it is from the geopolitical point of view, but also from the security point of view and let's say the livelihood point of view in the region. I hope that I'm wiser. It's my intention to travel to Baghdad early next year to discuss these issues in detail, and hopefully this study that I mentioned would be finalized by then, so that we would have something really, really concrete to take up. The next question about this kinetic/non-kinetic approach to terrorism, and what my predecessor indeed called the Africanization of jihad. He was very worried, Gilles de Kerkhoff, many of you certainly know him, was very worried about the things and the development especially in the Sahel region, in the coastal states. At the same time, of course, in East Africa, Horn of Africa, and in Mozambique as well. And now what we are discussing, and I think I was very impressed by the speech by the president of Niger, as Niger is one of our key partners in trying to see what the Europe could now do. And my angle is, let's say, the civilian approach in this question, kind of a multidisciplinary, non-kinetic approach. Could we bring something to these discussions? Could we bring something to the concrete activities in the region? And as I know that many of us, be it from the Europe or from the US, we are leaning towards Niger to see how we could do that. So also something a bit more concrete coming up in the coming months. There is, together with the EU CSDP missions in the region, we are planning to organize a seminar, a conference where we hopefully would get also very concrete proposals from the Nigerian side and from the whole Sahel region how we could proceed. Then the third thing that I just wanted to raise in the end is on this online radicalization aspect. The so-called terrorist content online regulation came into force this year in June, and actually it's a regulation which forces the internet providers and platforms to remove any terrorist content within 1 hour when there has been made a referral by competent authorities of the EU member states. And I'm very interested to see how this works. At the same time, I'm also convinced that the internet platforms have to actively do their own work and not only wait for these referrals, as has been the case until now, and to use artificial intelligence and other tools to tackle any terrorist content that we see in the digital world. We will do sort of and the Commission is also forced to do a sort of an impact study on this new legislation, how well it functions and whether it's efficient. So hopefully we'll also have in let's say in a year's time a better understanding how well this legislation actually works. One thing that I'm still in the online world, I'm worried, while let's say the bigger platforms, service providers are actually quite committed into these rules, we have the smaller ones which might not actually go along with the current state of play, and we have to see how we could bring them on board and how to share the best practices with them as well. But certainly a challenge for all of us.
Thank you. Olivier, let me turn to you. I was taken by your comment about how the terrorist attacks that have taken place in France were self-radicalized people who were not radicalized, who were radicalized by the global jihad, but not by the local jihad that France has been fighting. Do you anticipate that changing in the future? And if not, does that say that the Salafist jihadi movements that are very violent, I mean, just this week, I think there was another huge, in Mali, a massacre, but that they are different from some of their other predecessors in that they're not looking for external attacks? And how does that change European or French policy?
Well, if you look at the local jihad now, they have an anthropological basis. Let's take in my university, there is a research group working on pastoralism in Sahel. They are anthropologists, they don't do politics. They work on the relationship between climate change and pastoralism. But they came to us, we had a program on jihad and terrorism, they came to us because they told us, you know, our pastoralists now, they became jihadists. They are fighting for jihad from Mauritania to Somalia. So we have a social routing, you would say, of jihad in local jihad, which explains that there is no or little, until now, spillover outside. While in Europe, you don't have a social basis for jihad. The jihadists, they are not lone wolves, you know, they are in groups, networks, and so, but they radicalize online, exactly. Very few of them did radicalize on a mosque, and so, and none of them had a past of, I would say, social worker, political militant, unionist, and so, or simply preacher. They have no past of being a militant in a Muslim community or society. And that's the good news. And the bad news, because it's very difficult to spot them, because they have no routing. But the good news is that there is no social movement with them. While in the local jihad, yes, you have a social movement, and for good reasons, unfortunately.
Thank you. Mona, you teased us with your last comment that you had solutions to these very difficult problems. Please.
Indeed. So I'm going to pick up on a few of Mr. Salmi's comments as well, because I think there is a consensus that, I think for obvious reasons, that the situation in northeast Syria, the situation of the El Hol camp, is simply unsustainable. And the answer is to empty the camp. The answer is for countries to take responsibility for their citizens and bring them home to the extent possible, understanding the complexities in that. There are 28,000 Iraqis in the camp, and Iraq recently has agreed to begin to take its people home. It has started. I think that the magnitude of that challenge is enormous and cannot be underestimated. Syria, as rightly pointed out, poses different problems. There are those in the camp who simply cannot return home. They hail from regime-held areas and are not willing to go home. And we have to respect the international law with respect to a non-refoulement, not pushing people back to places where they're not comfortable. All of that being said, I do think there are some things that can be done to start to accelerate this process. One is I think we need to change the narrative a bit. I fully understand the notion of a ticking time bomb. It's used a lot, and it rightly raises the issues of the urgency of this challenge. However, I think what happens is we begin to demonize and also oversimplify this challenge because, as I said, the majority of the residents of the camp are children. And so I think we have to start to add more nuance into how we think about and conceptualize this challenge and understand that it is both, yes, a security challenge, but it is also a protection issue. Secondly, I think, the themes of this conference in many ways embody what the response should look like. Interdependence, resilience, cooperation, all of those qualities have to come into an international response. So when we talk about these 28,000 Iraqis that we hope to be able to help resettle back in their communities of origin, it's on the international community, I would say, to help with that. And by that I mean through stabilization and other types of assistance, help prepare those communities for the return of their citizens. This is going to require quite a lot of work. These are populations that carry stigma. There are issues with reconciliation and justice on the part of the receiving communities. All of those challenges have to be addressed, and I think the international community can play an important role. Finally, I think it's important to understand better what happens to women and children when they return. And we don't have enough data on that. There's early work being done. Human Rights Watch just issued a report of 100 children, so a small number, but that, according to the report, thus far, returning to countries in Europe and in Central Asia from El Hol and from Iraq are faring quite well. And only 4% of those who've returned are noting challenges with their reintegration. So we have to, I think, continue to get more data on that, and that might help back to the beginning with changing that narrative. If we understand their children, if we understand that, in fact, they aren't security threats and there are ways for them to come home and reintegrate peacefully and successfully into their communities.
Thank you. Hisham, I want to go back to the point that you emphasized about right-wing terrorism. It seems like, to me, some of the frameworks that we've talked about in other terrorist threats, intellectual frameworks, actually do apply. There is an ideological movement that spans borders about great replacement theories, about others, and you see terrorists in the United States, in Europe, put out manifestos that echo, in fact, sometimes copy and paste language from other terrorists in other borders that have the same ideas. You have the same kind of self-radicalization through the internet. I'm wondering what we've learned in terms of the de-radicalization efforts from other contexts that might also apply to right-wing terrorist threat, which I think you appropriately say is growing.
So that's the million-dollar question, isn't
Right.
it? So over the past few years, Olivia knows this project. It's called Greece, funded by the European Commission, actually, looking at how radicalization looks on an international scale, and best practices from different countries. The information is all online. It's called Greece, like the movie, .eui.eu, and the difficulty, I think, has really been in identifying how actually complicated and complex the problem can be. So before moving on to the right wing, let's just go back to the radical Islamist threats. There's a tendency in far too many parts of the analytical arena to just reduce, simplify, and one size fits all sort of answer, right? So it's all ideological, it's all about bad ideas. Or, no, that's all an excuse and it's got nothing to do with that, and it's all about, social circumstances and whatnot. And the reality is that it's just very different in different places with different people. There was one case of a Malaysian from the north of Malaysia, pretty well off, did not suffer from any sort of marginalization issues or anything like that. He was radicalized by watching stuff on the internet about what was going on in Syria and went off and joined Jabhat al-Nusra. Very different case from a Syrian, okay, who's seen his entire family be murdered by Assad's forces, and then at the same time remembering that even though I don't think there's a single family in Syria that hasn't suffered from the conflict, the numbers of people that went into radical groups is actually incredibly small as compared to, what you might expect if it's all about, social circumstance, right? And I don't think we've gotten that balance right yet. I don't think people realize how complex it can actually be. And when it comes to the far right and how that looks, again, I think people might be jumping a little bit and not understanding, again, how far this can go. There was this case in Singapore of somebody who wasn't even white. He was of Indian origin, I think Catholic, was completely enamored with great replacement theory and was going to attack a mosque. Now, the Singaporean authorities found out about it. They disrupted the attack. So thankfully, nothing actually happened. But he was very motivated by what happened in New Zealand. It was actually supposed to be on the anniversary of the New Zealand massacre. And I think that you have this sort of spreading of this kind of fear and nativism. But again, for me, what's really concerning is that they're not operating in a vacuum. Great replacement theory is by definition far right. It's also found across the political spectrum in the center and center right of many European states and in the United States, right? It's not on the margins. And that to me represents, a really bizarre situation for us to be in where, we're talking about these groups, we're talking about these threats as though they're on the margins like, the quote unquote far right Islamists. No, they're in the center. And they are providing space for these things to take place. And I don't know what that, well, I suspect I know what it means for the near future, but we're certainly not learning about lessons from previous terrorist threats at all. On the contrary, I think we're really stuck in this ideological universe. We should be looking at best practices, as few as there are. Okay, but we should be looking at best practice. Instead, we're denying that the problem actually exists to the scale that it is. With regards to, I'll bring it back to the UK for a moment. We have a prevent strategy that is supposed to be about countering radical ideas. All of the data shows we should be focusing on the far right. All the data shows, and it's very clear within the Home Office and so on. But we have a political imperative on top that says, no, we're not going to do that. Actually, quite blatantly, nope, that's wrong. We're going to focus on Islamist stuff. You're putting our country in jeopardy. Like, this is no longer an ideological joke. No, this is actually a threat to our national security.
Thank you very much. Let me ask a question to the entire group about a subject that has not come up, and that's Iranian-backed terrorism. Iran is the most important state sponsor of terrorism. They are the only country in the world that routinely provides precision weaponry to non-state actors with the intent and direction of them using that across international boundaries to intentionally target civilians. One country in the world that has that as a policy. We've seen recent cases in Europe of an attempt of a bombing in Paris by Iranian-backed elements. And then we have wider, we're going to put aside the nuclear issue, which has dominated European and American policy towards Iran. But just focusing on the terrorism question, this challenge very much continues. There are ongoing questions about whether the IRGC should be, which is behind many of these, all of these actions, should be seen as a terrorist organization. Some of their supporters of Houthis and others should be seen as terrorists. Whether other proxies like Hezbollah should be appropriately divided into political and non-political and terrorist organizations. I'd be interested in all of your views about that, starting here.
Thank you. When I served as the head of the Finnish intelligence, actually one of my colleagues once mentioned that whenever I'm interviewed in public, I have a magnificent skill not to reply to those questions that I put forward. But allow me try to anyway on that aspect. That of course this question of let's say state-sponsored terrorism has come up now with the very recent conclusion by the European Parliament concerning Russia, not so much about Iran. Just keeping in mind, and perhaps this is my reply for the time being, is that we do not list countries as such the same way as US does, as the EU. And I think this is exactly now one of the, let's say, the mandates for us, for my office as well, to look into this issue. Should we do that, based on the European Parliament's decision? And, what would that then mean, and what would be the right ways to tackle this issue? It was also interesting, if I may, and this is indeed, a bit of a footnote, it was interesting to see that in the US there is also a discussion now concerning Wagner, whether that should be listed as a terrorist organization. So that probably would then go in a way to the same direction as you were referring to. But indeed, until we don't have that system listed as such, let's see what we can do. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, you have state terrorism when the terrorists are agents of the state. They are usually citizens from the country, and they are on duty. In this case, it's political, diplomatic, and strategic problems. It's not a problem of sociology of terrorism, of who is doing what. No. So it has to be addressed by addressing the state, who is responsible. Then you have some states who use existing terrorists. We use people who were not motivated by this state. So we know, and many countries did that at a time. Iran, Pakistan also, etc., Russia also. It's not new. It was very often the case with the communist countries in the 60s and so. So here we have two problems. One is to address the state who is responsible for supporting or for having given asylum, for instance, for a terrorist group. For instance, the Taliban, we discussed that with the Taliban and with the Doha agreements, and they agreed not to let terrorists act from their territory. But then when you have, homegrown local terrorists, it's not a matter of being supported by a foreign state. It's a really indigenous and local issue that we have to address locally first.
Mona?
So I'm going to pick up exactly on Professor Hua's last point, which is to look at the context in which particularly Iranian-backed groups are thriving, whether it's in Lebanon as Hezbollah or certainly in Syria or Iraq. And here I think it's clear, you see that these groups do well in places that have suffer from either security vacuums, as we see in Syria and Iraq, and to some extent even in Lebanon as well, places that have a record of very, very poor governance, high corruption, inadequate social services, et cetera. I think the key is to take the long view on this and to really, again, as an international community, focus on how to build back strong institutions of governance in these countries. Lebanon is a collapsing, if not utterly failed state. We haven't talked about it. Its collapse is breathtaking in the short period of time that it's occurred. And it just underscores just the depth and the breadth of the socioeconomic and governance crises, which quite frankly have been in place since just around about 9/11 in 2001, and which really have not been adequately addressed in the 20 years since.
Michel?
So I have not too much to add to what's already been said. I agree with it, but there is one aspect here that, again, from a policy perspective, creates a massive issue. There have been discussions about Iran and engaging with Iran in DC and in other places on the European continent. And very often I think when we're going to particularly the Gulf and to the Arab world, well, that part of the Arab world, okay, we're talking completely different languages in terms of security architecture. They're really worried about Iran. And frankly, they have very good reason to be worried about Iran. And it is used, one must say it is used as a way to deflect, to distract, that happens quite a lot. But it's also based on a genuine concern and fear that Iran is being given oxygen to actually continue the sorts of activities that you say. And many of these capitals don't think that we take that terribly seriously. Again, it is used as a way to deflect and distract. I fully accept that, but it's not without merit or basis. And I think we need to be able to keep that in mind, that as we engage with these partners, for all of their flaws, for all of what everybody knows in terms of different issues, they have a genuine concern here. And it's not one that we can simply ignore or put to one side in favor of some sort of, grand idea about peace in the region. I'll never forget being in another room similar to this one, where there was a discussion about, how the Arab world and the Iranians should just accept to, quote unquote, share the region. And I didn't think that anybody could say a statement like that without incredible offense being felt by people who actually lived in the region, as though there were a bunch of, leaderless tribes that needed to be allocated to, different kingpins or something, like, poor people in a mafia. No, I don't think they're interested in that. I don't think they ought to be interested in that, and I don't think it's a very long-term sustainable solution either. So that kind of approach, I think, is very problematic.
I think that's a very strong point. We only have a minute left, so I'm going to close with just a speed round. If there's anything that you wanted to say about this very large subject of the changing of terrorism that you didn't get a chance to say, a couple of sentences from each one.
I definitely would look into the new technologies aspect. I think it will bring challenges, huge challenges, issues such as metaverse might be a thing that we have to understand. What does it mean? At the same time, of course, delivering us with huge advantages, but it has also challenges and risks also from the terrorism point of view.
That's right.
I think that we should look at the narratives that motivate the different kind of radicals. It's beyond, the purely socio-economic conditions. It's beyond the issue of religion. It's something which is more individual and that we can observe now with people who are in jail or who are in court for terrorist actions. It's far more, there is a personal dimension which should not be neglected.
I would highlight the central role that women play in this challenge, and in particular women, if you look at the whole population and these women returning, they are women-headed households. Women are key to ensuring their children's protection, their children's education, and I think that they are too often ignored in the equation, and so I think we need to put them front and center on this.
Yeah, you're here.
I feel like the flashing means I should call a friend or choose 50-50. Shameless plug, we're releasing a book from this Greece project early next year on different types of extremisms. And I think the different types of extremisms discussion really needs to be taken seriously. Climate crisis is going to create all sorts of things in terms of how people respond and react. We've already seen these new conspiracy theory-based extremisms that are actually not far right. They're completely new, different things. And environmental extremism, environmentalist extremism is going to take root as well for very justified reasons, I'm sure. But I think that we need to have an open mind about the width and breadth of the things that we're going to be facing.
With that, I'm going to say thank you very much to this wonderful panel.
Thank you, Will.
I really appreciate everyone here. Thank you.
Recording stopped.